He found twins sleeping on his doorstep, two little girls shivering in rags, barely holding on to each other in the dead of night. He thought they'd just wandered off, until he saw the note beside them. He took them in, gave them warmth, safety, love. But when they finally opened their eyes and spoke their first words, he broke down in tears. Who left them there? What are they running from? And how far will he go when the man they fear comes looking? Protect them, don't let him find them. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The winter wind rattled the old windows of James Calloway's cafe as he made his final rounds. His footsteps echoed through the empty dining room while he wiped down the last table, the checkered cloth moving in slow, methodical circles across the worn surface. The cafe had been quiet today, the bitter cold keeping most folks home, wrapped in blankets and huddled around their heaters. James paused at the front window, watching snowflakes dance in the yellow glow of the street lamp. His breath fogged the glass as he double-checked the closed sign hanging crooked on its hook. 52 years in this sleepy southern town, and winter nights like these still made him feel impossibly alone. With practiced movements, he counted the register, locked the safe, and flicked off the lights one by one. The familiar jingle of his keys accompanied him as he secured the back door, pulled his woolen coat tight around his shoulders, and stepped out into the biting cold. The walk home was short but sharp with winter's sting. His boots crunched through fresh snow, leaving a trail of solitary footprints down Cedar Street. The houses he passed were all warm squares of light, filled with family dinners and evening routines. His own home waited dark and silent at the end of Maple Lane, a small craftsman house with peeling white paint and blue shutters that needed touching up come spring. Inside, James shed his coat and boots by the door, rubbing his hands together to chase away the chill. The house creaked its usual welcome as he moved through the rooms, turning on lamps and adjusting the thermostat. In the kitchen, he filled his copper kettle with water and set it on the stove, pulling his favorite tea tin from the cabinet above. While the water heated, he built a fire in the living room hearth, something he did more for comfort than necessity these days. The flames caught quickly on the dry wood, and soon the room filled with their warm, flickering light. The kettle's whistle drew him back to the kitchen, where he prepared his evening tea with practiced precision. 1 spoon of honey, a splash of milk, and the perfect steep time he'd learned through years of quiet nights just like this one. James settled into his old armchair, its leather worn smooth and soft from countless evenings spent reading. The novel he'd started last night waited on the side table, its bookmark keeping his place halfway through. The story was nothing special, just another mystery he'd picked up from the second-hand bookstore, but it helped fill the silence. He had just turned to a new page when he heard it, a soft knock at the front door, so faint he might have missed it if the house hadn't been so still. James lowered his book, listening. The wind howled outside, and for a moment he thought he'd imagined the sound. Then it came again, more urgent this time. Frowning, James set aside his tea and book. It was nearly 9 o'clock, far too late for casual visitors, especially on a night like this. He made his way to the door, his sock feet silent on the hardwood floors. The porch light cast long shadows through the front window, and when he opened the door, the sight before him stole his breath away. 2 little girls stood huddled together on his welcome mat, their small bodies shaking with cold. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and they were as different as night and day. One child had skin the color of rich earth and tightly coiled black hair dusted with snow. The other was pale as a winter morning, with long white hair that seemed to glow in the porch light and eyes like amber coins. Both wore torn coats far too thin for the weather, and their bare feet were red from the cold. Between them sat a wicker basket, and tucked inside was a piece of paper, crumpled and damp with snow. James picked it up with trembling fingers and read the hastily scrawled message, "Protect them. Don't let him find them." James didn't hesitate. He stepped back, opening the door wide. Come in quickly," he said, his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. The girls moved as one, still clutching each other's hands as they shuffled inside. Their feet left wet marks on his floor, but James couldn't have cared less about that. "Let's get you warm," he said, already moving toward the laundry room. He pulled out his softest blankets and tossed them in the dryer, setting it on high. In the kitchen, he heated up the homemade chicken soup he'd made for the cafe that morning, grateful now for the leftovers. While the blankets warmed and the soup heated, he helped the girls out of their wet coats. They hadn't spoken a word, but their eyes followed his every movement, wide with a mixture of fear and hope that made his heart ache. When the dryer buzzed, James wrapped each girl in a warm blanket, the heat of the fabric bringing the first hint of color back to their cheeks. He guided them to the kitchen table where 2 bowls of steaming soup waited. Their hands shook as they lifted their spoons, and James found himself steadying them, helping them take small sips until the worst of their shivering subsided. The fire still crackled in the living room, and James led them there next. The girls curled up together on his old couch, their blankets tucked around them like cocoons. The warmth and food had done their work. Their eyelids were growing heavy, their small bodies relaxing into the cushions. James sat in his armchair, watching as they drifted off to sleep. They remained holding hands even in slumber, their faces peaceful despite whatever circumstances had brought them to his door. The knot in his chest grew tighter as he considered the note in the basket, the desperate plea for protection. Then, in the quiet of the room, one of the girls stirred slightly. "Mama?" she murmured, the word slipping out like a prayer before she settled back into sleep. The simple word hit James like a physical blow, settling heavy in his stomach like a stone. He stayed in his chair as the hours crept by, unable to look away from the sleeping children on his couch. The fire slowly died to embers, and the wind continued its lonely song outside. But James remained awake, bearing witness to this moment that he knew somehow would change everything. The next day, the morning sun filtered through James's faded curtains, casting soft shadows across the living room. On the couch, Naira stirred first, her dark eyes widening as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her sudden movement woke Leah, whose golden eyes snapped open in confusion. The girls clutched each other tighter, their breath quickening as they remembered where they were. "It's okay," James said softly from the kitchen doorway, keeping his distance so as not to frighten them further. "You're safe here. Remember last night? The snow?" He gestured to the window where fresh snow still blanketed the ground. The girls nodded slowly, their grip on each other loosening just slightly. James noticed how they seemed to move as one unit, perfectly in sync despite their striking differences. "Would you like some breakfast? I make pretty good scrambled eggs," he offered, his voice gentle and steady. Another cautious nod from both girls. In the kitchen, James worked quietly, whisking eggs with a splash of milk the way his mother had taught him. He could feel their eyes following him as he moved around the space, popping bread into the toaster and warming a pan on the stove. When he glanced over, they had settled at the small kitchen table, still wrapped in yesterday's blankets. The eggs came out fluffy and light, the toast golden brown. James set 2 plates in front of the girls, along with small glasses of orange juice. They waited until he stepped back before picking up their forks, eating slowly and carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear. After breakfast, James made the calls he knew he had to make, first to the police, then to Child Protective Services. He spoke in hushed tones from his study, keeping the door open so the girls could see him but staying far enough away that his words wouldn't frighten them. The authorities arrived within the hour. A kind-faced social worker named Ms. Thompson sat with the girls while 2 officers took James's statement. They examined the wicker basket and the note, took photographs, and filed a report. By afternoon, missing children posters were being printed and distributed throughout the county. Days passed with no response to the posters. No one came forward to claim the girls. Through gentle questioning, Ms. Thompson learned they were twins, a fact that seemed impossible given their appearance but was confirmed by their identical birthmarks and shared memories. They remembered their names, Naira and Leah. But when asked about their past, about their mother, or where they came from, they grew quiet and withdrawn. James received permission to keep them temporarily while the investigation continued. He watched as 1 week stretched into 2, then 3. The girls slowly began to trust him, though they spoke little and never let go of each other for long. During those weeks, James transformed his life around them. He cleared out his cluttered spare room, replacing boxes of old books with 2 small beds he found at a local furniture store. He chose colorful quilts, purple for Nira, blue for Leah, and hung simple curtains that matched. At the cafe, he started training Sarah, a capable young woman who'd worked for him for years, to take over as assistant manager. He reduced his hours, arranging his schedule so he could be home when the girls woke up and there to make them dinner each evening. Late at night, after they'd fallen asleep, James sat at his computer, researching everything he could. He learned about caring for black hair, watching tutorials, and ordering special products for Naira's beautiful coils. He studied albinism, understanding now why Leah's eyes were so sensitive to light and buying her protective sunglasses. He read articles about childhood trauma, about how to create safe spaces and build trust. The learning curve was steep, and James made plenty of mistakes. His first attempt at braiding Naira's hair was a disaster that ended with both of them giggling at his clumsy fingers. He burned the first few dinners he tried to cook, unused to preparing meals for 3. But he kept trying, kept learning, kept showing up every day with patience and love. One snowy evening, about a month after the girls had arrived, James sat between their beds reading The Tale of Peter Rabbit. It had become their nightly routine, a story before bed, always with James sitting where both girls could see him, his voice soft and steady as he turned the pages. As he closed the book, James did something he'd been wanting to do for weeks, but hadn't dared. He leaned over and gently kissed Naira's forehead. "Good night, Naira," he whispered. Then he moved to Leah's bed, placing an equally gentle kiss on her forehead. "Good night, Leah." For a moment, everything was still. Then, like sunshine breaking through clouds, both girls smiled at him. Real smiles, warm and genuine, lighting up their entire faces. In that moment, James knew with absolute certainty they weren't going anywhere. They were his. Spring arrived in gentle waves, bringing with it warm breezes and the sweet scent of blooming dogwoods. The kitchen in James's house filled with laughter one Saturday morning as he taught the girls how to make pancakes. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the flour that dusted the air like fairy dust. "Like this?" Naira asked, standing on a step stool as she carefully measured flour into a bowl. Her dark curls were tied back in neat braids. James had finally mastered the technique after weeks of practice. "Perfect," James nodded, watching as Leah cracked an egg with surprising precision. Her golden eyes sparkled with concentration, her white hair catching the morning light. "Can I stir?" Both girls asked in unison, then giggled at their synchronized request. James handed them each a wooden spoon, showing them how to mix without splashing. The first pancake turned out slightly misshapen, but the girls declared it beautiful anyway. They sat at the kitchen table, syrup dripping from their forks as they chatted about starting school on Monday. Their excitement was tinged with nervousness. James could see it in the way they kept glancing at each other between bites. Later that afternoon, James helped them try on their new school clothes. He'd bought them matching backpacks in different colors, purple for Naira, blue for Leah, and packed them with fresh notebooks and pencils. The girls ran their fingers over the supplies reverently, as if touching something precious. "Will we be in the same class?" Leah asked, her voice quiet as she organized her pencil case for the 3rd time. "The principal promised you'd be together," James assured them. He'd insisted on it during their enrollment meeting, understanding instinctively how important it was for the twins to stay close. Monday morning arrived with a mix of excitement and anxiety. James drove them to school early, walking them to their 1st grade classroom. Mrs. Peterson, their teacher, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James noticed how her gaze lingered on Naira's dark skin, then shifted to Leah's pale features with obvious confusion. "They're twins," James explained simply, his hand resting protectively on each girl's shoulder. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose. "How interesting," she said, her tone making the word sound like something else entirely. "Leah, why don't you take a seat up front? Naira, there's space in the back row." James felt Naira stiffen beside him. "They'd prefer to sit together," he said firmly. "We have a seating chart," Mrs. Peterson replied, her smile growing tight. It's best for classroom management. Throughout the day, the differences in treatment became painfully clear. When Naira whispered to her deskmate about a math problem, Mrs. Peterson immediately scolded her. Yet when other students chatted freely, the teacher seemed not to notice. During reading time, Leah received effusive praise for her pronunciation, while Naira's equally correct answers were met with surprise and skepticism. At recess, a group of girls surrounded Leah, fascinated by her unusual appearance. "You look like a princess from a fairy tale," one said admiringly. But when Naira approached, the same girl wrinkled her nose. "Why does your sister look so dirty?" Another child pointed at Leah and laughed. "She looks like a ghost." The word hung in the air like poison. Leah's golden eyes filled with tears. Naira grabbed her sister's hand and pulled her away, their fingers interlocked so tightly their knuckles turned white. After school, James took them grocery shopping. He noticed immediately how the store clerk followed Naira down every aisle, watching her with suspicious eyes. When Naira reached for a box of cookies, the clerk stepped forward as if expecting her to steal it. James's quiet patience snapped. He asked for the manager, his voice calm but firm. "Your employee is profiling my 6-year-old daughter," he said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "I'd like an explanation." The manager apologized profusely, but the damage was done. Naira's shoulders had already slumped, her usual brightness dimmed. Even Leah seemed subdued, her golden eyes darting nervously between her sister and the watching customers. On their way home, they passed Mrs. Johnson from next door. She stopped James with a warm smile that turned patronizing as she glanced at the girls. "It's so wonderful what you're doing for that poor black child," she said, as if Naira couldn't hear her. "And Leah looks just like you. She must be your real daughter." James felt both girls tense beside him. He wanted to correct Mrs. Johnson, to explain that both girls were equally his, that family wasn't about matching skin colors. But he could see the hurt already settling into Naira's eyes, the confusion clouding Leah's face. That evening after dinner, Naira sat on the couch with her knees pulled up to her chest. "Did I do something wrong today?" she asked in a small voice. "The teacher kept watching me, and the store lady followed me, and Mrs. Johnson ... She trailed off, unable to finish. Leah sat beside her sister, their shoulders touching. "Everyone acted weird," she said softly. "They said nice things to me but mean things about Naira. I don't understand." James knelt in front of them, taking both their small hands in his. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly, his heart aching at the doubt in their eyes. "Some people just don't know how to see what's right in front of them." He pulled them both into a tight hug, feeling their arms wrap around his neck. "I promise to protect you," he whispered, "no matter what." The seasons turned like pages in a book, marking a year since the girls had first appeared on James's doorstep. Summer faded into fall, then winter, and finally spring bloomed again. The twins were 7 now, growing taller and more aware of the world around them. James had settled into a comfortable rhythm, morning rushes to school, afternoons at the cafe where the girls did homework in their favorite booth, and evenings filled with bedtime stories and warm hugs. But lately, something felt different. James noticed it in the small moments, the way Naira's shoulders tensed when Leah received praise, how Leah's smile dimmed when people commented on their differences. The emotional distance between them grew like a shadow at sunset, subtle at first but increasingly impossible to ignore. At school, Naira's natural curiosity and strong sense of justice began drawing unwanted attention. During history lessons, she'd raise her hand to question why certain stories weren't being told, why some voices seemed missing from their textbooks. "Mrs. Peterson," Naira asked one day, her voice clear and steady, "why don't we learn about black inventors?" The teacher's lips pressed into a thin line. "Naira, we're following the curriculum. Please stop disrupting the class." "But I'm not disrupting," Naira protested. "I'm just asking." "That's enough," Mrs. Peterson cut her off. "One more outburst, and you'll miss recess." James received regular notes about Naira's behavioral issues. Meanwhile, Leah's teachers praised her quiet demeanor and academic performance. They'd say, "She's such a pleasure to have in class," while casting sideways glances at Naira. The divide became painfully clear at Sarah Miller's birthday party. The Millers lived 3 houses down, and their daughter had invited both twins. James watched from the kitchen window as the girls arrived, matching purple dresses swishing around their knees. Mrs. Miller greeted them at the door, her smile faltering slightly as she looked between them. "Oh, Leah, honey, come inside. We're about to play some party games." She turned to Naira with a different expression. "The other children are playing in the backyard. Why don't you join them?" "But Leah and I always play together," Naira said, reaching for her sister's hand. "The living room's quite full already," Mrs. Miller insisted. "And it's such a lovely day outside." James, who had stayed to help supervise, felt his jaw tighten. Before he could intervene, the girls were already being separated. Leah ushered inside to join the circle of giggling children, Naira directed toward the back door. Through the window, James watched Naira standing alone near the swing set, her purple dress a lonely splash of color against the green grass. Inside, Leah sat stiffly among the other children, her golden eyes repeatedly darting to the window. When Mrs. Miller brought out the cake, she made sure Leah got an extra large piece with extra frosting. "Such a unique little girl," she cooed, patting Leah's white hair. "Like a little angel." Through the window, James saw Naira watching, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. The drive home was silent. Naira stared out the window, her usual stream of stories and observations completely absent. Leah kept trying to catch her sister's eye, but Naira wouldn't look at her. Once home, Naira went straight to their room. When Leah tried to follow, Naira turned away. "Naira?" Leah's voice wavered. "Please talk to me." Silence. "What did I do wrong?" Leah asked, tears beginning to fall. "I didn't want to stay inside. I wanted to play with you." James stood in the doorway, his heart heavy. How could he explain that this wasn't about anything they'd done? How could he help them understand a world that judged them before knowing them? He sat on the edge of their bed, gathering both girls close. "Sometimes," he began carefully, "people see what they want to see, not what's really there. They make choices based on how someone looks, not who they are inside." "But why?" Leah asked, her golden eyes swimming with tears. "Because they're wrong," James said simply. "Because they've learned the wrong things about what makes a person valuable or beautiful or good." Naira remained silent, but James could feel her trembling against his side. That night, after James had tucked them in and turned out the light, Naira's voice cut through the darkness. "You're lucky," she said to Leah. "People like you." There was a long pause before Leah responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not when you're around." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and heavy. James, standing in the hallway, watched as his daughters shifted to opposite sides of their shared bed, their usual tangle of limbs and whispered secrets replaced by a gulf of silence. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes against the sting of tears. This was a wound he couldn't kiss better or fix with a Band-Aid. This was the world's cruelty seeping into their innocent hearts, teaching them to see themselves through others' prejudiced eyes. James stood there long after the girls had fallen asleep, watching their small forms in the dim light from the hallway. Naira curled tight like a fist, Leah stretched out like a question mark, the space between them vast and aching. Days later, the autumn morning crept through the kitchen windows, painting golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor. James moved efficiently between the counter and refrigerator, assembling 2 lunchboxes with practiced care. Turkey sandwiches with the crusts cut off for Leah, peanut butter and banana for Naira, their favorites. He tucked in small notes, as he did every day, simple messages of love and encouragement. "Girls, 5 minutes until we need to leave," he called up the stairs, adding apple slices to each container. Footsteps thundered above, followed by the familiar sound of drawers opening and closing. Naira appeared first, her school uniform neat and pressed, her hair styled in careful braids that James had learned to do after countless YouTube tutorials and gentle practice sessions. "Morning, Dad," she said, grabbing a piece of toast from the plate he'd prepared. Leah emerged more slowly, squinting against the bright morning light that streamed through the windows. Her white hair caught the sunbeams, creating a halo effect around her head, but her golden eyes were narrowed in discomfort. James noticed her distress immediately. "The sun's particularly bright today," he said, reaching into a drawer. He pulled out a pair of wraparound sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat they'd bought specifically for days like this. "Here, sweetheart." Leah looked at the items with resignation. She'd been struggling more lately with her light sensitivity as the autumn sun hung lower in the sky, creating harsh angles of light that were harder to avoid. "Do I have to?" she asked quietly. "They'll help," James said gently. "And they look pretty cool too." Leah took the items reluctantly, placing the hat on her head and sliding the glasses over her eyes. The relief was immediate, but James could see the way her shoulders slumped slightly. "You look like a movie star," Naira offered, trying to help. Their relationship had been strained lately, but the sisters still had moments of connection that made James's heart warm. The morning routine continued smoothly until they reached the school. James watched them walk through the front doors, Leah still wearing her protective gear, Naira walking close beside her. He said a silent prayer, as he did every morning, for their safety and happiness. But by afternoon, that prayer seemed to have gone unanswered. James received a call from the school while he was preparing for the lunch rush at the cafe. A window had been broken during recess, and somehow, despite multiple witnesses placing her elsewhere, Naira had been blamed. When he arrived at the school, he found Naira sitting outside the principal's office, her face set in a familiar mask of controlled anger. Leah stood nearby, trying to tell a teacher what had really happened. "I saw everything," Leah insisted. "Naira was with me on the swings the whole time. We were practicing our jumping." The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, James remembered, gave Leah a patronizing smile. "You don't have to lie for her, dear. I know you want to protect your sister, but honesty is important." James watched Leah's face crumple in frustration. "I'm not lying. Why won't you believe me?" After a tense meeting with the principal where James firmly defended Naira with the support of 2 other students who confirmed her whereabouts, the situation was reluctantly resolved. But the damage was done. The ride home was thick with tension. Later that afternoon, as James helped the girls with their homework at the kitchen table, he noticed Leah becoming increasingly fidgety. She kept glancing at Naira, then looking away quickly. "What is it?" James asked finally. Leah hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from her backpack. "Amanda invited me to her sleepover this weekend," she said in a small voice. Naira's pencil stopped moving. "Just you?" Leah nodded, not meeting her sister's eyes. "Of course," Naira said, her voice rising. "Of course they only invited you. They always only invite you." "Naira," James started, but she was already standing, her chair scraping against the floor. "They only like you because you look like them," Naira shouted, tears forming in her eyes. "Because you're pale and pretty and different, they think you're special." "It's not my fault," Leah screamed back, jumping to her feet. "It's not my fault I look like this. I didn't ask to be different. I didn't ask for any of this." "Girls," James tried to intervene, moving between them, but their emotions had reached a breaking point. "You don't know what it's like," Naira continued, her voice cracking. "Everyone always thinks I'm the bad one, the mean one, the troublemaker. And you just get to be perfect Leah with her perfect white hair and her perfect manners." "You think I like being stared at?" Leah shot back. "You think I like people treating me like I'm some kind of freak? At least people see you. They look right through me like I'm actually a ghost." James managed to separate them, sending them to opposite corners of the house to cool down. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. Dinner barely touched, homework finished without their usual chatter. When bedtime came, James tucked them in as always, but the usual warmth was missing. No silly jokes, no requests for extra stories, no giggles or whispered secrets. Just 2 girls lying as far apart as their shared bed would allow. The night settled around them like a heavy blanket. James lingered in the doorway longer than usual, watching as Naira turned her back to her sister, curling into herself. The moonlight filtering through their window cast long shadows across the room. After a long while, Leah's whisper broke the silence. "I didn't want to go without you." Naira didn't respond, but in the dim light, James could see her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The space between them seemed to grow wider, colder, filled with all the things they couldn't say, all the hurts they couldn't heal. The room felt colder than the night before, as if the autumn chill had somehow crept inside, settling in the gap between two sisters who used to be inseparable. The winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as James bundled up the girls for their trip downtown. It had been weeks since the sleepover incident, and though things weren't back to normal between Naira and Leah, he hoped this special outing might help bridge the gap. "Everyone got their mittens?" James asked, adjusting Leah's scarf. The girls nodded, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. The walk to Miller's candy shop wasn't long, but the bitter wind made their cheeks rosy and their noses run. Leah hummed softly as they walked, a tune from their morning cartoons. Her white hair peeked out from under her wool hat, catching snowflakes that sparkled like tiny diamonds. Naira walked a few steps ahead, jumping over cracks in the sidewalk, her braids bouncing with each leap. The small bell above the candy shop door chimed as they entered. Warm air wrapped around them, carrying the sweet scent of chocolate and sugar. Colorful jars lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with every kind of candy imaginable. Lollipops as big as dinner plates stood in rainbow rows near the counter. "Remember, you can each pick 2 things," James said, helping them remove their winter layers. Naira made a beeline for the lollipop display, her eyes wide as she compared the sizes. "Look at this one, Dad," she called out, pointing to a swirled purple and blue creation that was nearly as big as her face. James chuckled, watching as she carefully examined each option. For a moment, everything felt normal. Just a father taking his daughters for a treat. No tension, no painful questions, no divided loyalties. Leah wandered through the aisles, trailing her fingers along the glass jars. She stopped at a display of imported chocolates, each piece wrapped in shimmering foil. When she thought no one was watching, her small hand darted out, slipping a piece into her coat pocket. The elderly shopkeeper, Mr. Miller, noticed from behind the counter. His weathered face crinkled into an indulgent smile. He walked over to where Leah stood, still admiring the chocolates. "Kids will be kids," he said warmly, reaching out to tousle Leah's white hair. "Just make sure to pay for the next one, sweetheart." Leah's cheeks flushed pink, but before she could respond, Naira appeared beside her, reaching for her sister's hand. The change in Mr. Miller's demeanor was instant and stark. His kind smile vanished, replaced by a hard, suspicious glare. "And you?" he growled, his voice losing all its previous warmth. "What did you take?" His hand shot out, grabbing Naira's wrist roughly. Naira's eyes went wide with fear. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. I didn't take anything," she stammered. "She didn't," Leah shouted, her voice cracking. "She didn't take anything." James had been examining a display of candy canes when he heard the commotion. He turned to see Mr. Miller holding his daughter's wrist, Naira's face twisted in panic, and Leah shouting desperately. "Let go of my daughter," James said, his voice low and dangerous. He crossed the store in 3 quick strides. Mr. Miller released Naira's wrist but continued glaring at her. "Just making sure," he said stiffly. "Can't be too careful these days." James felt his anger rising like a tide. He looked at Leah, then back at Mr. Miller. "You saw who took it," he said, his words precise and measured. "But you went after her." He gestured to Naira, who was now pressing herself against his side, trembling slightly. The shopkeeper's face reddened. "Now see here." "No, you see here," James cut him off. "I watched you pat my other daughter on the head when she took that chocolate. Kids will be kids, right? But this child," he placed his hand protectively on Naira's shoulder. "This child you grabbed and accused without seeing anything at all." The silence in the store grew thick and heavy. Other customers had stopped browsing to watch the confrontation. Mr. Miller's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Come on, girls," James said, helping them back into their coats. "We're leaving. He guided them toward the door, then turned back one last time. "And Mr. Miller? You just lost yourself a customer. Permanently." The walk home was quiet. The earlier lightness of the day completely evaporated. Snow began to fall more heavily, but none of them noticed. James's mind raced with all the things he wished he'd said, all the ways he wished he could protect his girls from moments like this. In the kitchen, James made hot chocolate, their usual comfort drink. The girls sat at the table, their untouched mugs creating rings of condensation on the wooden surface. Naira's wrist showed faint red marks where Mr. Miller had grabbed her. "Why do people like Leah more?" Naira asked suddenly, her voice small but clear in the quiet kitchen. Before James could respond, Leah spoke through tears. "Why do people look at me like I'm not human?" James sat heavily in the chair between them, his heart aching. For the first time since the girls had come into his life, he had no comfort to give. No wise words, no reassuring platitudes, no way to make sense of the senseless prejudice that colored their world so differently. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, snow continued to fall, coating the world in white, while inside, 3 hearts struggled with questions that had no easy answers. The days following the candy shop incident crept by like molasses. James noticed how the usual warmth of their home had been replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to follow them from room to room. Even the morning routine, usually filled with sleepy chatter and gentle teasing, had become mechanical and quiet. At breakfast, Naira kept her eyes fixed on her cereal bowl, stirring the same spoonful around and around until the flakes turned to mush. Leah sat at the opposite end of the table, picking at her toast with trembling fingers. James tried to fill the space between them with cheerful talk about the weather or what they might have for dinner, but his words fell flat in the thick atmosphere. "How about we watch a movie tonight?" James suggested one evening, hoping to create some sense of normalcy. "We could make popcorn, build a blanket fort like we used to." Leah's eyes lit up briefly, but Naira just shrugged and mumbled something about homework before disappearing into their room. When James checked on her later, he found her curled up in bed, facing the wall, though it was only 7 o'clock. During family dinners, James noticed how Naira would finish her food quickly and ask to be excused, while Leah would linger at the table, pushing food around her plate with a lost expression. The distance between them seemed to grow wider with each passing day, like a crack in a window slowly spreading. At school, the tension finally reached its breaking point. James was in the middle of preparing lunch orders at the cafe when his phone rang. The principal's voice on the other end was stern and formal. "Mr. Calloway, there's been an incident involving Naira. We need you to come down to the school immediately." When James arrived, he found Naira sitting outside the principal's office, her uniform rumpled and a scratch on her cheek. Her hands were clenched into tight fists in her lap, and she wouldn't meet his eyes. Mrs. Peterson, Naira's teacher, recounted the events with barely concealed disapproval. Tommy Wilson made an unfortunate comment, and Naira responded with physical violence. "We simply cannot tolerate this kind of behavior." "What exactly did Tommy say?" James asked, his voice level but firm. Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, children say things sometimes." "What did he say?" James repeated. "He called her the stray dog James picked up." Leah's small voice came from the doorway. She stood there, twisting the hem of her sweater. "I tried to tell Mrs. Peterson what really happened, but—" "Leah, please return to class," Mrs. Peterson interrupted sharply. On the drive home, Naira finally spoke. "They never believe me," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They always think I started it, even when I didn't." James gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I believe you, sweetheart, and we're going to talk to the principal tomorrow about Tommy's behavior." That afternoon, Leah tried to approach Naira in their room. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to tell them what happened. I really did." Naira whirled around, her eyes flashing. "You always say sorry, but it doesn't change anything." Her voice cracked on the last word. "It doesn't change how they treat me. It doesn't change how they treat you different. Nothing changes." That evening, after a quiet dinner where the only sounds were forks scraping against plates, James pulled out their worn copy of Charlotte's Web. It was their favorite book, one they'd read together countless times. The girls settled onto the couch, Naira on one end and Leah on the other, with James in the middle. As he read, his voice gentle and steady, the familiar words seemed to soften the sharp edges of the day. When he reached the part where Charlotte dies, he noticed both girls growing still. Tears began rolling down Leah's cheeks and Naira's breath hitched with suppressed sobs. "You have been my friend," replied Charlotte. "That in itself is a tremendous thing." James's voice wavered slightly as he read. He could feel both girls trembling beside him, their shared grief over Charlotte's death breaking through the walls they'd built between them. For a moment, they were just sisters again, sharing the same sadness, feeling the same things. James continued reading, but his eyes kept darting between them, watching as their rigid postures slowly relaxed. When bedtime came, the girls climbed into their shared bed without their usual reluctance. James tucked them in, kissing each forehead gently before turning out the light. He lingered in the doorway, watching as their silhouettes settled under the covers. In the darkness, Leah's hand moved across the space between them, reaching out across the mattress. There was a moment of tension, a breath held in suspension as Naira noticed the gesture. Then, slowly, carefully, Naira's hand moved to meet her sister's. No words were spoken, but their fingers intertwined in the darkness. James watched as both girls shifted closer to each other, their breathing gradually sinking as they drifted off to sleep. For the first time in days, they fell asleep holding onto each other, the space between them finally bridged by their joined hands. James stood in the doorway a moment longer, his heart both heavy and hopeful. The moonlight streaming through their window cast a soft glow over their sleeping faces, making their differences fade away until they were just his daughters again. Just sisters, just children finding their way back to each other in the dark. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwoods through the quiet neighborhood as James collected the mail from his front porch. Bills, advertisements, and a plain white envelope with no return address caught his attention. His fingers hesitated over the unmarked envelope, a slight tremor in his usually steady hands. Inside his kitchen, he set the other mail aside and carefully opened the mysterious envelope. A photograph slipped out, landing face down on the worn wooden table. When he turned it over, his breath caught in his throat. The image showed Naira and Leah as toddlers, maybe 2 years old, sitting side by side in a double stroller. Their faces were rounder, baby-soft, but unmistakable. Naira's dark curls were shorter then, barely reaching her shoulders, while Leah's white blonde hair was tied in tiny pigtails. James's fingers trembled as he flipped the photo over. Scrawled in hasty handwriting were the words that made his stomach clench. "They're not yours. He'll come for them." Without hesitation, James strode to the fireplace in the living room. The flames were still flickering from the morning's chill, and he watched as the photograph curled and blackened in the fire. But the note? He couldn't bring himself to destroy it completely. Instead, he folded it carefully and tucked it into an old novel on the highest shelf of his bookcase, where the girls couldn't reach. Over the next few weeks, James found himself jumping at unexpected sounds and checking the locks multiple times each night. He installed a second deadbolt on the front door, testing it repeatedly before bed. The hardware store owner raised an eyebrow when James also purchased window locks and a motion sensor light for the backyard, but James just smiled tightly and paid in cash. His new routine became more rigid. Instead of letting the girls walk the 3 blocks to school with their friends, he began walking them himself, adjusting the cafe's opening hours to accommodate this change. In the afternoons, he'd be waiting outside their classroom door before the final bell, earning curious glances from other parents. Naira and Leah noticed the shift in their father's behavior. They saw how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings during their walks, how his grip on their hands was a little tighter than before. At the playground, he no longer sat on the bench reading his book but stood at the edge of the play area, watching. One evening, after tucking the girls into bed, James sat in his armchair before the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and his thoughts drifted to the photograph he'd burned. He didn't hear Leah's soft footsteps until she was standing beside him. "Daddy?" she whispered, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight. "What's wrong?" James started, then tried to smile. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Why aren't you in bed?" "You look scared," Leah said simply, climbing onto the arm of his chair. "Like when there's thunder." James pulled her onto his lap, and soon Naira appeared too, as if sensing her sister's absence. She stood in the doorway, her dark eyes serious in the dim light. "Come here," James said softly, and Naira joined them, squeezing into the chair beside her sister. For a long moment, James just held them, feeling their warm weight against him, listening to their steady breathing. Finally, he spoke. Someone from your past might be looking for you," he said carefully, choosing his words. "I need you both to be extra careful. Stay close to me or your teachers at school. Don't talk to strangers, even if they say they know you." Naira's body tensed against him. "Is it someone bad?" "I don't know," James answered honestly. "But I promise you both, no matter what happens, no matter who comes looking, I'll protect you. You're my daughters, and nothing will change that." Leah wrapped her arms around his neck, and Naira pressed her face into his shoulder. They sat there until the fire began to die down, and James carried them back to their room, tucking them in once more. Later that night, in the darkness of their bedroom, Naira and Leah lay facing each other. The wind outside rattled the windows, making the curtains sway in the moonlight. Neither girl could sleep. "Do you think it's our real dad?" Naira whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Leah was quiet for so long that Naira thought she might have fallen asleep. Then softly she replied, "I don't think he's like James." The wind picked up, making the old house creak and groan. The girls moved closer together, their foreheads almost touching. Naira reached for Leah's hand under the covers, and Leah squeezed back tightly. They held onto each other in the darkness, listening to the wind and the distant sound of James checking the locks one more time. In their shared silence, both girls thought about the father they'd never known, and the one who'd chosen them, who read them stories and learned to braid their hair, who made them feel safe even when he was scared himself. Outside, the spring wind continued to rattle the windows, but inside, wrapped in each other's embrace, the girls found comfort in their shared warmth and the sound of James's footsteps in the hallway, keeping watch. Days later, the summer heat pressed against the cafe windows like a heavy blanket. Inside, the air conditioning hummed steadily, keeping customers comfortable as they sipped their afternoon coffee. James stood behind the counter, his practiced hands moving efficiently between the coffee maker and cash register. His eyes occasionally drifted to the back booth where Naira and Leah sat doing their homework. Naira's pencil moved across her notebook in swift, sure strokes. She wasn't doing math anymore. She'd switched to sketching, her favorite activity. Her dark curls fell forward as she bent over her work, completely absorbed. Next to her, Leah sat with her nose buried in a book, her white blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the window. Her sunglasses rested on the table beside her, and she'd positioned herself carefully to avoid the direct glare. The familiar jingle of the doorbell caught James's attention. A woman stepped inside, pausing just beyond the threshold. She was black, thin to the point of frailty, wearing clothes that seemed too large for her frame. Large sunglasses covered much of her face despite the dimness of the cafe interior. Something about her made James's skin prickle with unease. "Welcome to Callaway's," he said warmly, maintaining his usual friendly demeanor. "What can I get for you today?" The woman approached the counter slowly, but her head was turned toward the back booth. Even through the dark glasses, James could tell she was staring at the girls. She stood there for several long moments before seeming to remember where she was. "Tea," she said, her voice rough and quiet like sandpaper on wood. "Just plain tea." James nodded and began preparing her order, but he kept her in his peripheral vision. She chose a seat near the middle of the cafe, facing the girls' booth. She didn't remove her sunglasses or touch her tea once he brought it to her. After about 20 minutes, Naira stood up, tugging at Leah's sleeve. "Bathroom," she announced, and Leah followed her sister toward the back of the cafe. As soon as they were out of sight, the woman rose from her seat and approached the counter. "Are they—" She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles showed white against her dark skin. "Are they your daughters?" James felt his chest tighten. He'd been asked this question many times before, usually by nosy customers or judgmental neighbors. But something about this woman's tone was different, desperate, almost fearful. "Yes," he answered firmly, watching her reaction carefully. "They are." The woman's whole body seemed to tremble. Without another word, she turned and hurried out of the cafe, leaving her untouched tea behind. James watched through the window as she practically ran down the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner. The rest of the afternoon passed normally, but James couldn't shake his unease. As closing time approached, he asked his assistant manager to help the girls pack up their things while he began the closing routine. Through the front windows, movement caught his eye. Across the street, partially hidden behind a parked car, stood the woman from earlier. She was watching the cafe intently. "Sarah," James called to his assistant manager, trying to keep his voice casual. "Would you mind taking the girls to the back office for a minute? I forgot to show you something about the new scheduling system." Once the girls were safely out of sight, James stepped outside. The woman noticed him immediately and began backing away. Without thinking, James crossed the street, moving quickly but trying not to appear threatening. "Wait," he called out softly. "Please, I just want to talk." But the woman turned and ran, her oversized clothes billowing behind her as she disappeared down an alley. James followed, his heart pounding, but by the time he reached the alley's entrance, she was gone. The narrow passage between buildings was empty except for a few scattered leaves skittering across the pavement. Back at the cafe, James tried to act normal as he locked up and drove the girls home. But his mind kept returning to the woman's face, to the way she'd trembled when asking about the girls, to her desperate flight when he'd tried to approach her. After dinner and bedtime stories, James made sure the girls were asleep before retrieving the old note from its hiding place in the book. He sat at his kitchen table, reading the words he'd memorized long ago. Protect them. Don't let him find them. The motion sensor lights he'd installed after receiving the threatening photograph cast strange shadows through the windows. James got up and checked each lock again, then added new ones to the back door and garage entrance. He knew he wouldn't sleep tonight, not with the memory of the woman's haunted expression fresh in his mind. Standing in the darkness of his kitchen, James began to wonder if he'd been wrong about the woman. Her behavior had seemed suspicious at first, but now he remembered the fear in her voice, the way she'd shaken when looking at the girls. Perhaps she wasn't a threat at all. Perhaps she was trying to warn them just like the note had done. James pulled out his phone and began searching through local missing persons reports from around the time the girls had been left on his doorstep. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but something told him the mysterious woman was connected to the girls' past and to whoever he was, the person they needed protection from. In their bedroom, Naira and Leah slept peacefully, unaware of their father's vigil. The new motion lights clicked on and off occasionally as neighborhood cats wandered past, making James start each time. He kept returning to the window, watching the empty street below, wondering if the woman would appear again, and what she might be trying to tell them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as James watched the girls through the chain-link fence. It was recess time, and he'd taken to checking on them during his mid-morning break from the cafe. Naira was showing off her cartwheel skills while Leah clapped encouragingly from a safe spot in the shade. That's when he saw her again, the woman from yesterday. She stood at the corner of the fence, partially hidden behind a tree, but her gaze was fixed on the girls. This time, James didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward her, his steps firm but unthreatening. She noticed his approach but didn't flee. Instead, she gripped the fence tighter, her knuckles white against the metal links. As James got closer, he could see tears streaming from beneath her sunglasses. "Their names," she said before he could speak, her voice barely above a whisper, "are Naira and Leah." She swallowed hard. "I named them." James felt his heart skip a beat. He gestured to a nearby bench away from the playground. "Would you like to sit down?" She nodded, following him with shaky steps. Once seated, she removed her sunglasses, revealing dark eyes rimmed with exhaustion and worry. "My name is Sarah," she said, watching the girls play. "I'm their mother." James sat quietly, giving her space to continue. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. "I was married to a man named Jameson," she began, her voice growing harder. "He came from old money, old beliefs. When the girls were born..." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "Naira came first. When he saw her dark skin, he refused to even hold her. But Leah..." Sarah's voice cracked. "He claimed Leah immediately, said she was perfect, pure, wanted to take her and leave Naira behind." James felt his stomach turn. He'd seen enough prejudice in their small town to imagine the scene she described. "I wouldn't let him separate them," Sarah continued. "He became violent, threatened all of us. Said he'd make sure I never saw either of them again if I didn't comply. So I ran." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We lived on the move, shelters, motels, wherever we could hide. But his men, they always found us eventually." She turned to face James fully. "That night when I left them with you, I'd seen one of his men in town. I knew they were closing in. I watched your cafe for days. Saw how you treated people, all people, how kind you were." Her voice softened. "I thought it would be temporary, just until I could shake them off our trail. But then they kept following you," James finished quietly. Sarah nodded. "I couldn't risk leading them back to the girls, so I stayed away, kept moving. But I never stopped watching from a distance, making sure they were safe." James absorbed this information, thinking of all the small moments over the past 2 years that suddenly made more sense. The mysterious note, the photograph, the constant feeling of being watched. "They should hear this from you," he said finally. "Would you like to come to the house?" Sarah's eyes widened with hope and fear. "Are you sure?" James nodded. "Meet me there at 3 after school." The afternoon sun filled the living room as James opened the front door. The girls stepped inside, chattering about their day, but fell silent when they saw Sarah standing in the middle of the room. She'd cleaned up, changed clothes, but still looked fragile and nervous. Sarah slowly knelt down, tears flowing freely now. "I never meant to leave you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was trying to save you, both of you." The girls stood frozen. Neera's expression was guarded, her small hands clenched at her sides. Leah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move either. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Sarah explained everything again, simpler this time for the girls to understand. She told them about their father's cruelty, about running to protect them, about watching from afar to make sure they were safe. James stood nearby, ready to intervene if needed, but letting this moment unfold. When Sarah finished speaking, neither girl moved for a long moment. Then Leah took a small step forward, but Naira grabbed her hand, holding her back. The hurt and confusion on their faces made James's heart ache. That night, after Sarah left with a promise to return tomorrow, the girls lay in their beds, the room dark except for their star-shaped nightlight. Neither had spoken much since Sarah's revelation. "She left us," Naira whispered into the darkness, her voice small but sharp with pain. There was a rustling of blankets as Leah turned to face her sister. "But maybe she didn't want to," she replied softly. Downstairs in the kitchen, James sat across from Sarah at the table. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets through the open window. "If you're back," James said carefully, studying Sarah's face. "He might be too." Sarah's expression hardened as she nodded. "He is." The evening sun had already dipped below the horizon when James began his usual closing routine at the cafe. He wiped down the last table, his movements slower than usual after a long day. The past week had been a blur of emotions since Sarah's return, visits with the girls, careful conversations, and small steps toward healing. A sharp knock at the front door made him jump. Through the glass, he could see a tall figure in an expensive suit. James hesitated, then moved toward the door. Something about the man's posture set him on edge. As James unlocked the door, the stranger's face came into full view under the cafe's porch light. He was handsome in a cold way, with perfectly styled silver-streaked hair, and eyes like chips of ice. His smile didn't reach those eyes. James Calloway? The man's voice was smooth as silk, but there was steel underneath. I'm Jameson Harrow. James felt his blood run cold. He knew that name. Sarah's warnings echoed in his mind. I'm here for my daughter, Jameson said, still wearing that empty smile. James gripped the doorframe. I think you should leave. Oh, I don't think so. Jameson reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. These are court documents. I'm filing for custody of Leah. He paused, his smile turning cruel. Just Leah, of course. The sound of running footsteps came from behind them. Sarah appeared, breathless, having spotted Jameson from across the street. Get out, she shouted. You stay away from them. Jameson didn't even glance at her. He kept his eyes fixed on James, speaking as if Sarah wasn't there. You stole her, he said softly. She's white. She belongs with her real family. Those girls are sisters, James said firmly. They belong together. Sisters? Jameson laughed, a hollow sound. Look at them. Leah is pure, special. That other one. He waved his hand dismissively. Well, we both know what she is. James felt rage building in his chest. Get off my property. Read the papers, Mr. Calloway. Jameson turned to leave, then looked back. Oh, and Sarah, you might want to consider how your interference could affect the outcome. With that, he walked away, leaving the envelope on the doorstep. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations and mounting tension. James's lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, explained their options, but her expression was grim. He has money and influence, she warned. And in this town, word spread quickly through their small community. At the grocery store, people stared and whispered. Some approached James directly, offering unwanted opinions. It's natural he'd want his own child back, Mrs. Henderson from the garden club said, patting James's arm. We understand, dear. At school, the situation was worse. Parents began pulling their children away when Leah approached. Others made a point of being extra nice to her while completely ignoring Naira. The twins' teacher reported that Leah had become withdrawn, while Naira grew increasingly defensive. During recess one day, Naira sat alone on a bench, watching as a group of girls clustered around Leah. Two mothers stood nearby, speaking in what they thought were hushed tones. It's such a shame, one said. That poor little white girl stuck with, well, you know. That other one doesn't count anyway. Naira's shoulders stiffened. She didn't cry until she got home. The courthouse date was set for 3 weeks away. Each day brought new challenges. Jameson's lawyers sent packets of paperwork, each thicker than the last. They questioned James's ability to care for an albino child, cited statistics about mixed-race households, and emphasized the importance of cultural heritage. Sarah stayed close, helping where she could, but Jameson's threats kept her from taking too public a role. She watched from the sidelines as her daughters struggled to understand what was happening. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at school, Naira stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She stared at her reflection for a long time, her dark skin, her coiled hair, her beautiful brown eyes that matched her mother's. Leah stood in the doorway, watching her sister with worry. Naira touched the mirror, tracing her features. Do you think he'd love me if I looked like you? She asked quietly. Leah didn't answer. Instead, she crossed the bathroom and wrapped her arms around her sister, holding her tight. They stayed that way for a long time, two halves of the same whole, while somewhere in town, a clock ticked down to their court date. James watched them from the hallway, his heart heavy. The legal documents sat on his kitchen table, full of cold words that tried to reduce these girls to statistics and categories. But here they were, just two sisters holding each other, trying to make sense of a world that wanted to tear them apart. The whispers continued around town. At the cafe, business dropped as some regular customers stopped coming. Others made a point of showing up more often, offering quiet support. The local newspaper ran a story about the custody battle, complete with a photo of Leah that notably cropped Naira out of the frame. Each night, James read to both girls before bed, maintaining their routine despite the chaos. He chose stories about siblings, about courage, about standing together against adversity. Sometimes Sarah joined them, sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes never leaving her daughter's faces. The courthouse date loomed closer. Patricia worked late into the nights, building their case. Sarah provided documentation of Jameson's past behavior, though much of it would be inadmissible. James kept every school record, every drawing, every photo of the girls together, creating a paper trail of their life as a family. But in quiet moments when the girls thought no one was watching, the weight of it all showed. Leah began having nightmares. Naira grew quieter, more watchful. They clung to each other more than ever, as if afraid someone might physically pull them apart at any moment. And still the clock ticked forward, counting down to the day when a judge would decide if blood was thicker than love, if the color of skin mattered more than the bonds of sisterhood, if a family could be measured by matching features rather than matching hearts. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. James adjusted Leah's white bow tie and smoothed Naira's pressed collar, his hands trembling slightly. The girls wore matching navy dresses, a deliberate choice to show their unity. Sarah waited by the courthouse steps wearing a simple black suit that seemed to hang off her thin frame. Inside the imposing building, their footsteps echoed on marble floors. The courtroom doors loomed ahead like the entrance to another world. James held both girls' hands as they walked through security, feeling their small fingers tighten around his. The courtroom was already half full when they entered. Familiar faces from town filled the wooden benches, some supportive, others merely curious. Patricia, James's lawyer, waited at their table with neat stacks of documents arranged before her. Across the aisle, Jameson sat with his legal team, his expensive suit pristine, his posture relaxed as if this were merely a business meeting. When the bailiff called for all to rise, the girls stood together, shoulders touching. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair and reading glasses, took her seat and reviewed the initial documents. Sarah was called to testify first. She walked to the witness stand, her steps unsteady, but her chin held high. After being sworn in, she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Harrow," Patricia began gently. "Miss Thompson," Sarah corrected, her voice quiet but firm. "I haven't used his name since I escaped." "Ms. Thompson, please tell the court about your marriage to Jameson Harrow." Sarah took a deep breath. "We met at a charity event. He was charming, successful. The abuse started slowly, controlling what I wore, who I saw. When I got pregnant, he was thrilled, until the girls were born." Her voice cracked. Naira came first. When he saw her dark skin, he changed, started screaming about contamination, about ruining his bloodline. He wouldn't even look at her. But when Leah came, Sarah wiped her eyes. He acted like Naira didn't exist, kept talking about his perfect daughter, his pure child. Sarah described the escalating abuse, the threats, the violence, the night she finally ran. He said he'd make Naira disappear, said no one would question it with his connections. I couldn't let him hurt my babies. Jameson's lawyer objected repeatedly, calling Sarah's testimony emotional manipulation and unsubstantiated claims. But Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about finding James's cafe, watching him care for both girls equally, seeing them thrive under his love. When Jameson took the stand, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He spoke with practiced charm, his words carefully chosen. "Of course I want my daughter back," he said, smiling at Leah. "She's my flesh and blood, my heritage. Look at her. She's clearly meant to be with her real family." "And what about Naira?" Patricia asked during cross-examination. Jameson's smile tightened. "That unfortunate mistake was Sarah's doing. I won't be held responsible for her indiscretions." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Naira stiffened in her seat. Leah grabbed her sister's hand and wouldn't let go. "Mr. Harrow," Patricia continued, "could you explain these photos?" She displayed images on a screen, Sarah with bruises, a broken arm, police reports filed and mysteriously disappeared. Accidents, Jameson said smoothly. Sarah was unstable, prone to self-harm. Patricia played audio recordings next, Jameson's voice thick with rage, spewing racial slurs and threats. "I'll make that little mongrel disappear," his voice snarled through the speakers. "No one will even look for her." Jameson's lawyers objected, claiming the recordings were inadmissible, possibly doctored. They launched into their own presentation, photographs of James's modest home compared to Jameson's mansion, statistics about mixed-race households, questions about James's ability to provide culturally appropriate care for a white child. "What right does this man have to raise this child?" Jameson's lawyer demanded. "No legal adoption, no blood connection, no cultural understanding of her heritage. Mr. Harrow can provide everything she needs: the finest schools, the best opportunities, a proper understanding of her background." Throughout it all, the girls sat silent, watching. Leah never released Naira's hand. When Jameson's lawyer referred to them as separate cases, Leah's grip tightened until her knuckles went white. James wanted to shield them from it all. The cruel words, the barely veiled racism, the way Jameson's team tried to erase their bond as sisters. But the girls insisted on staying, on facing it together. The judge listened to all testimony, her expression neutral. When both sides had presented their cases, she adjusted her glasses and spoke. "This is a complex case requiring careful consideration of multiple factors. I will need time to review all evidence thoroughly before making my ruling." She set a date for her decision, 2 weeks away. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jameson's smile turned predatory as he stood, straightening his tie. Sarah slumped in her seat, exhausted from her testimony. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Camera flashes burst like lightning. Microphones thrust forward. Questions flew like arrows. "Mr. Calloway, how do you respond to claims about cultural heritage?" "Mr. Harrow, what about allegations of racism? Girls, how do you feel about possibly being separated?" James pulled his coat off and wrapped it around both girls, creating a barrier between them and the press. Patricia and Sarah flanked them, helping clear a path through the crowd. As they hurried toward their car, Naira pressed close to her sister. "He's not taking us," she whispered fiercely. Leah squeezed her hand. "Never," she whispered back. The morning after the hearing, silence hung heavy in James's house like a thick fog. The familiar sizzle of pancakes on the griddle did nothing to lift the somber mood. James flipped another golden circle, watching as Naira pushed her untouched breakfast around her plate with her fork. Leah hadn't even picked hers up, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, its bold headline screaming up at them. "Local man battles racist father for custody of mixed twin girls." James had tried to hide it, but Naira had already seen it during their morning routine. Now it sat there like an unwelcome guest, impossible to ignore. Usually, morning cartoons would be playing on the small kitchen TV, filling the space with cheerful background noise. Today, the screen remained dark. The tick of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Maybe some fresh strawberries would help," James offered, his voice gentle as he placed a bowl of cut fruit between the girls. Neither reached for it. Sarah's restless pacing could be seen through the kitchen window. She moved back and forth across the small backyard, her arms wrapped around herself, stopping occasionally to stare at nothing before resuming her anxious movement. The morning dew still clung to the grass, dampening the hem of her pants. James settled at the dining room table, spreading out the stack of legal documents Patricia had left with them. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied paragraph after paragraph of legal jargon, making notes in the margins. The scratching of his pen joined the clock's ticking in the morning quiet. At the kitchen table, Leah sat with her sketchbook open before her. Her favorite drawing pencil moved across the paper in short, aggressive strokes. The lead snapped with a sharp crack. She reached for her pencil sharpener, her movements mechanical. A minute later, another snap and another. Naira watched her sister from across the table, her dark eyes intense. The sound of each breaking pencil tip seemed to wind her tighter until she couldn't hold back anymore. "He's not your dad," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "You know that, right?" Leah's hand stilled over her drawing. She nodded slowly, but no words came. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the paper, where dark lines crossed and tangled into an unrecognizable mess. James looked up from his paperwork, watching the exchange with concern etched on his face. But before he could speak, Sarah came in from the backyard, her face drawn with worry. "Time for school," she said softly, though her tone suggested she'd rather keep them home. The school day proved even harder than the morning. As the girls walked through the hallways, whispers followed them like shadows. In the cafeteria, a group of older kids approached their table. "Hey!" one boy called out, his voice cruel with false curiosity. "How come your real daddy only wanted one of you?" Neera's hands clenched into fists. Leah reached for her sister's arm, but she was too late. Neera had already launched herself across the table, her small body trembling with rage. The fight was over quickly. Teachers pulled them apart, but the damage was done. In the principal's office, Neera sat with her arms crossed, a suspension notice on the desk before her. When James arrived to pick her up, her tough facade crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as he knelt beside her chair. "It's like I don't exist to him," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Like I never did." James gathered her in his arms, holding her close as her small body shook with sobs. Leah stood in the doorway, having refused to return to class without her sister, her own tears falling silently. That evening, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house, James took the girls to Henderson Park. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the walking path as they made their way around the lake. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of water and earth. For a little while, they could pretend things were normal. The girls collected smooth stones near the water's edge. Leah found one shaped like a heart and slipped it into Neera's pocket without a word. Neera responded by helping Leah build a small pile of the prettiest rocks they could find. James watched them, his heart aching with love and worry. Sarah met them at the house when they returned, her face pale in the porch light. In her trembling hands, she held an envelope. Plain white, no markings, the kind you could buy at any store. "This was under the door," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James took it, already knowing whatever was inside wouldn't be good. He pulled out a photograph, clearly taken during the court proceedings. It showed Leah sitting at the defendant's table, her white hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Across the image, written in bold black marker, were the words, "One way or another, she's mine." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. James studied the photograph, his jaw tight with anger. Without a word, he walked to the front door and began checking the locks. Sarah followed, adding another deadbolt to the back door. "No one goes out alone," James said firmly, gathering the girls close. "Not for any reason." The girls nodded, understanding the gravity in his voice. Neera gripped Leah's hand tightly, while Leah pressed closer to her sister's side. Sarah moved through the house, drawing all the curtains closed, turning the home into a fortress against the growing darkness outside. That night, the house stood quiet but alert, like a sentinel keeping watch. Extra locks gleamed on the doors, windows were checked and double-checked, and a new security light cast its protective glow over the front yard. Inside, 4 people tried to find sleep, each knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of waiting, watching, and wondering what Jameson's next move would be. Days later, the storm had been building all evening, dark clouds gathering like bruises across the sky. Now, past bedtime, rain hammered against the windows with growing intensity. Thunder rolled in the distance, each boom a little closer than the last. James moved methodically through the house, checking every lock for the 3rd time that night. Front door, locked and bolted. Back door, secured with 2 deadbolts. Windows, all latched tight. He tested each one carefully, the routine both comforting and necessary. Upstairs, Neera and Leah had already fallen asleep in their shared bedroom. They lay curled together under a mountain of blankets, their breathing soft and synchronized. Leah's white hair spilled across the pillow like moonlight, while Neera's dark curls tangled with her sister's, a visual reminder of their unbreakable bond. James stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching them sleep, before gently pulling their door closed. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Wind howled through the trees, making branches scrape against the siding. The old house creaked and settled, its familiar sounds amplified by the storm. Sarah had taken the guest room down the hall, though James knew she probably wouldn't sleep much. None of them had been sleeping well lately. He could see light seeping under her door. She was likely still awake, reading or simply lying there, listening to the storm. James finally settled into his own bed, though sleep felt distant. The storm raged outside, nature's fury matching the turmoil in his mind. Lightning flashed, illuminating his room in stark bursts of white light. Around midnight, a different sound cut through the storm's chaos, a distinct creak from the front porch. James sat up, instantly alert. Before he could move, the house plunged into darkness as the power flickered and died. "Perfect timing," he muttered, reaching for the flashlight he kept by his bed. The beam cut through the darkness as he made his way downstairs to check the fuse box in the basement. The old house's wiring was temperamental during storms. This wasn't the first time they'd lost power. The basement stairs creaked under his weight as he descended. The air was damp and cool, smelling of earth and old wood. James located the fuse box on the far wall, its metal surface cool under his fingers as he checked each switch. Everything appeared normal. This was a neighborhood-wide outage, then. He turned to head back upstairs when Naira's scream shattered the quiet. "Elia! Elia!" James took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding. He burst into the girl's room to find Naira alone in the bed, blankets thrown back, her face wild with panic. "She's gone," Naira cried, scrambling to her feet. "I woke up and she wasn't here?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the flashlight's beam. "What's happening?" James was already moving, checking every room, calling Leah's name. When he reached the front of the house, his blood ran cold. The front door stood slightly ajar, rain spattering the floor through the gap. Muddy boot prints marked the hardwood, large prints a man's size. Back in the girl's room, a piece of paper lay on Leah's empty pillow. James's hands shook as he picked it up, reading the words written in an elegant, cruel hand. "She belongs with me now." "No," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no." She collapsed against the wall, sliding to the floor as sobs racked her body. "He has her. He took her." James was already dialing 911, his voice steady despite the fear crushing his chest. He reported the kidnapping, gave descriptions, answered questions. But the dispatcher's response was frustratingly measured. They would send officers, but with the storm and no confirmed location. Naira stood in the middle of the room, her small frame trembling. "I should have stayed awake," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "I should have stopped him. I felt her move, but I thought she was just getting water." Tears streamed down her face. "I should have protected her." James dropped to his knees beside her, gathering her into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her tears hot against his neck. "This is not your fault," he whispered fiercely. "None of this is your fault." The police arrived quickly, but their presence brought little comfort. They took statements, photographed the boot prints, collected the note. But their expressions said what their words didn't. Without a location, finding Leah would be nearly impossible, especially in this weather. As James watched them work, something nagged at his memory. During the custody battle, he'd seen something, a detail in Jameson's court documents, a logo, barely visible in the corner of some paperwork. He'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now. "The compound," he said suddenly, causing Sarah to look up. "Those documents from court, they had a logo, some kind of survivalist group deep in the woods, about 30 miles out near the old logging road." Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "The Heritage Society," she whispered. "He used to go there for meetings, said it was about preserving our way of life." Her face hardened. That's where he'd take her. James moved with sudden purpose, gathering supplies, flashlights, rope, first aid kit, water bottles. He stuffed them into a backpack, his movements quick and precise. Sarah appeared beside him, a crowbar gripped in her hands. Her eyes were red but determined. "I'm coming with you." "Me too," Naira insisted, already pulling on her rain boots. "I have to help save Leah." James knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. "I need you to be safe," he said firmly, "and strong. We're bringing your sister home, but I can't do that if I'm worried about you too." Tears welled in Naira's eyes, but she nodded, understanding. James hugged her tightly, then turned to Mrs. Chen next door, who had come over when she saw the police lights. She agreed to stay with Naira. The rain was still falling in sheets as James and Sarah loaded the truck. Through the front window, Naira pressed her hand against the glass, watching as their headlights disappeared into the stormy night. Behind her, the empty bed waited for her sister's return. The fog hung thick between the trees like ghostly curtains, turning the pre-dawn forest into a maze of shadows and mist. James killed the truck's engine and coasted to a stop beneath a cluster of towering pines, their branches providing natural cover from above. The rain had finally ceased, but water still dripped from leaves and branches, creating an eerie percussion in the silence. "This is close enough," he whispered, turning to Sarah. "We'll have to go on foot from here." They worked quickly and quietly, covering the truck with broken branches and fallen leaves until it blended into the undergrowth. James shouldered his backpack while Sarah gripped the crowbar tightly, her knuckles white against the metal. The forest floor was treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots, but they picked their way carefully through the gloom. After 20 minutes of careful hiking, they caught their first glimpse of the compound through the trees. James held up his hand, signaling Sarah to stop. They crouched behind a fallen log, its moss-covered surface damp against their palms. The compound sprawled across a cleared section of forest, a collection of weather-beaten trailers and rough wooden cabins arranged in a loose circle. A chain-link fence, topped with razor wire, surrounded the entire area. 2 guards in camouflage clothing patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung carelessly across their shoulders. They moved with the lazy confidence of men who weren't expecting trouble. James pulled out a pair of binoculars and scanned the compound methodically. His breath caught when he spotted movement in one of the larger cabins. Through the window, he could see Leah, her white hair unmistakable even in the dim light. She sat rigid in a wooden chair while Jameson loomed over her, his face twisted with barely contained rage. A video camera on a tripod was pointed at her face. Sarah grabbed James's arm. "What's happening?" she whispered urgently. James passed her the binoculars. They watched as Jameson gestured angrily, clearly trying to force Leah to speak into the camera. Even from this distance, the fear and defiance on Leah's face was clear. "She's my sister," Leah's voice carried faintly through the partially open window. "Naira is my family, not you." Jameson's hand raised as if to strike her, but he caught himself, aware of the camera. Instead, he leaned down, his face inches from hers, speaking through clenched teeth. James scanned the compound again, forming a plan. A large generator hummed near the eastern fence, surrounded by fuel cans and maintenance equipment. "There," he whispered to Sarah. "That's our way in." They circled the compound, keeping to the tree line. When they reached the generator shed, James pulled out a lighter and some rags from his backpack. Working quickly, he stuffed the oil-soaked cloth into an empty bottle he'd brought. "When this goes up, they'll all run this way," he explained softly. "That's when we move." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. James lit the rag and threw the bottle onto the pile of fuel cans. The effect was immediate. Flames erupted with a whoosh, quickly engulfing the shed. Black smoke billowed into the morning air. Shouts of alarm rang out across the compound. The guards ran toward the fire, joined by others emerging from the cabins. In the chaos, James and Sarah slipped through a gap in the fence that the guards had left unattended. They ran low between the buildings, using the smoke for cover. A guard appeared suddenly through the haze, but before he could raise his rifle, James tackled him. They fought briefly, a desperate, silent struggle, before James managed to knock him unconscious with a well-placed punch. Sarah had already reached the cabin where Leah was being held. The door was locked, but she swung the crowbar with all her strength, splintering the wood around the handle. The door burst open. Leah spun around, her golden eyes wide with shock and hope. "Mom," she gasped. "Baby," Sarah choked out, running forward. Leah flew into her mother's arms, sobbing. "He wanted me to say Naira wasn't my sister," she cried. "He wanted me to pretend she didn't exist." "Where is he?" James asked urgently, scanning the cabin. He ran out when he heard the explosion, Leah said. He went to get his gun. James scooped Leah up and they ran for the fence. The compound was in complete chaos now. Men shouting, smoke everywhere, the fire spreading to nearby buildings. They had almost reached their exit point when a voice cut through the confusion. Stop! They turned to see Jameson standing 20 feet away, a pistol leveled at them. His expensive suit was smeared with ash, his face contorted with rage. She's mine, he snarled, taking a step forward. She's my blood, my legacy. But before he could pull the trigger, police sirens pierced the morning air. Red and blue lights flashed through the smoke. One of the panicked guards, seeing the fire spreading out of control, had called 911. Jameson's moment of distraction was all it took. 2 state troopers tackled him from behind, the gun flying from his hand. He went down hard, screaming threats and racial slurs as they handcuffed him. James, Sarah, and Leah collapsed together on the wet ground, holding each other tightly as more police cars arrived. Leah trembled between them, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He tried to make me erase her, she whispered. He wanted me to pretend Naira wasn't real, but I wouldn't let him. She's my sister. Forever. 2 days later, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. James sat between Naira and Leah, his hands gentle on their shoulders. Sarah occupied the row behind them, her face drawn but determined. The evidence against Jameson Harrow lay spread across the judge's bench. Photographs, documents, and most damning of all, a USB drive containing security footage from the compound. The recording showed Jameson's attempts to force Leah to denounce her sister, his raised hand, his twisted ideology laid bare. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair, reviewed the materials with growing disgust. Her fingers drummed against the wooden bench as she examined police reports detailing Jameson's connections to various extremist groups. The compound raid had uncovered a network of hate that stretched far beyond one man's obsession with racial purity. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp with controlled anger. The courtroom fell silent, tension thick in the air. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations ceased. Mr. Harrow, she began, her voice cutting through the silence. Your actions demonstrate not only a complete disregard for the law, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what family truly means. You speak of blood and legacy while showing nothing but cruelty to these children. Both of them. Jameson sat at the defense table, his expensive suit unable to hide his dishevelment. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him. The evidence presented here today reveals a pattern of abuse, racial hatred, and criminal behavior that this court finds absolutely abhorrent, the judge continued. Your attempted kidnapping of Leah Calloway, your documented abuse of Sarah Harrow, and your involvement with known hate groups leave me with no doubt about this decision. She turned her attention to James, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Calloway, you have shown what true parenthood means. You opened your home and your heart to these girls without hesitation. You've protected them, loved them, and fought for them, both of them, equally and unconditionally. The judge straightened her papers, then delivered her ruling with clear finality. This court hereby grants full custody of both Naira and Leah to James Calloway, effective immediately. Mr. Harrow, you are barred from any contact with either child. Furthermore, given your recent criminal actions, you will be remanded into custody pending additional charges. Relief flooded through the courtroom. Naira and Leah clutched James's hands, tears streaming down their faces. Sarah covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. After the proceedings, Sarah found James in a quiet corner of the courthouse. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window, warming the wooden benches where they sat. The girls played nearby, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. James, Sarah began, her voice soft but steady. I need to tell you something. She watched her daughters for a moment before continuing. You're the only father they've ever known. I see that now. She pulled out a folder containing legal documents. I'm relinquishing my custodial rights, she explained, meeting his surprised gaze. But I'm not disappearing. I want to be part of their lives, if you'll let me, just not as their primary parent. They need stability, and you're that for them." James studied her face, seeing the mix of pain and love there. "They need their mother too," he said gently. "We can make this work." Outside the courthouse, an unexpected scene unfolded. People from town had gathered: shopkeepers, teachers, parents, and children. As James emerged with the girls and Sarah, applause erupted. Some faces showed shame, others joy, many were crying. Mrs. Peterson, who had once pulled her daughter away from Naira at school, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong," she said simply. "We all were." The local newspaper editor approached next, offering to run a story about their family, not as a scandal, but as a celebration of love transcending boundaries. Others came forward with similar gestures. The grocery store manager who had once followed Naira now offered free ice cream for life. Teachers promised to do better, to learn more, to change. That evening, they gathered around James's kitchen table, now their kitchen table. The windows were open, letting in the sweet spring air. Sarah had cooked her mother's recipe for jambalaya, filling the house with warm spices and memories. "Look what I drew today," Naira said, pulling out her sketchbook. The page showed 4 figures holding hands: James, Sarah, Leah, and herself, all surrounded by a heart. The artistic skill was remarkable for her age, each face captured with loving detail. Leah leaned over to see, her golden eyes bright with interest. "That's beautiful," she said, then burst into giggles as Naira added a silly mustache to James's portrait. James watched them, feeling something settle in his chest, a warmth, a rightness, a peace he'd never expected to find. The years of loneliness seemed distant now, replaced by the beautiful chaos of family. Later that night, the girls stood in their bedroom, which James had helped them repaint in soft blues and purples. They hung a new photograph on the wall, a simple snapshot taken outside the cafe. In it, James stood with his arms around both girls, all 3 wearing identical grins. The morning sun caught Leah's white hair like a halo, while Naira's dark curls bounced with laughter. Beneath the photo, they carefully wrote in matching handwriting, "Family isn't blood, it's love." James appeared in the doorway, watching as they stepped back to admire their handiwork. The girls climbed into their beds, and he moved to tuck them in, just as he had that first night so long ago. But now there was no uncertainty, no fear of temporary arrangements or future separations. He kissed each forehead gently and whispered, "You've always been mine." The summer sun painted golden streaks across the backyard as squeals of laughter filled the air. Naira darted between the flower beds, a blue water balloon clutched in her hand, while Leah zigzagged around the old oak tree, her white hair streaming behind her like a banner. "You can't catch me," Leah called out, ducking behind the tree trunk. Naira's aim proved true as the water balloon sailed through the air, exploding against Leah's shoulder in a spray of cool water. Both girls erupted in giggles, their joy pure and uninhibited. James stood at the grill, spatula in hand, watching his daughters play. The smell of grilling hot dogs mingled with the sweet scent of Sarah's potato salad cooling on the picnic table. These moments felt precious to him now. Ordinary afternoons filled with extraordinary happiness. "Dad!" Naira called out, her dark curls bouncing as she ran toward him. "When's the food ready?" "I'm starving." The word "dad" still made his heart skip a beat. It felt natural now, but no less special. "5 more minutes," he answered, flipping another hot dog. "Why don't you 2 dry off a bit?" Leah joined them, wringing water from her shirt. "Can we have extra ketchup on ours?" "Extra everything," James promised, reaching out to ruffle their hair. A few weeks later, James stood in front of his bedroom mirror, fumbling with a tie. The adoption ceremony was just hours away, and his fingers wouldn't cooperate. Nervous energy coursed through him, making simple tasks feel impossible. "You're doing it wrong," Naira announced from the doorway. She held up a red tie with tiny polka dots. "This one's better anyway." "No way," Leah countered, appearing beside her sister with a navy blue tie. "This one matches his eyes." James looked between them, amused by their serious expressions. "Why don't you two pick one together?" The girls huddled in his closet, emerging minutes later with a different tie altogether. Pale yellow with tiny suns scattered across it. Leah held it up proudly. "Because we're your sunshine," she explained, her golden eyes bright. "And you're ours," Naira added firmly. James knelt down, taking the tie from them with trembling hands. "It's perfect," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. The courthouse looked different today, less intimidating, more welcoming. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting warm patches across the wooden floors. Familiar faces filled the benches. Sarah, sitting in the front row with tears already gathering in her eyes. Mike, James's assistant manager from the cafe, who had closed the shop for the morning to be there. Even Mrs. Peterson and other neighbors who had once viewed their family with suspicion now sat smiling supportively. The judge, a different one from the custody hearing, carried herself with gentle authority. She smiled as she reviewed the adoption papers, nodding approvingly. "James Calloway," she began, her voice clear and warm, "you have demonstrated what true parenthood means. These children have found in you not just a guardian, but a father who loves them unconditionally. From this day forward, you are their father in every way that matters." James knelt before Naira and Leah, his eyes brimming with tears. "You've always been mine," he whispered, his voice catching. "This just makes it official." "Dad!" Both girls cried out simultaneously, throwing themselves into his arms. The word echoed through the courtroom, followed by applause and sniffles from the audience. Sarah approached them afterward, her own eyes wet. "They couldn't have a better father," she said softly, squeezing James's hand. The cafe had been transformed for the celebration. Colorful balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and streamers draped from every corner. The usual scent of coffee and pastries mixed with the sweetness of chocolate cake, James's special recipe, made with extra sprinkles at the girls' insistence. Music played from the old jukebox and people danced between the tables. Naira taught Mrs. Peterson's daughter how to twirl properly, while Leah showed Mike's son her favorite ballet moves. The divisions that had once separated them seemed to dissolve in the joy of the moment. "Dad," Naira called out, tugging on James's sleeve, "we have a surprise for you." "Close your eyes," Leah instructed, taking his other hand. They led him carefully through the cafe and out onto the sidewalk. The summer breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the planter boxes he'd installed last spring. "Okay, open them." James opened his eyes to find a new sign hanging above the cafe's entrance. Hand-painted in careful letters were the words, "Calloway and Daughters Cafe." The ampersand was decorated with tiny flowers, and each letter showed the distinct artistic touches of both girls, Naira's bold strokes and Leah's delicate details combining perfectly. James stared at the sign, unable to speak. He remembered the lonely nights in this cafe, before the knock on his door changed everything. Now, looking at those words, Calloway and Daughters, he felt the weight of all they represented. Family, belonging, love chosen rather than given. The girls watched him anxiously. "Do you like it?" Leah asked. "Sarah helped us with the painting," Naira added quickly. "But we designed it ourselves." James pulled them both close, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "It's the most beautiful sign I've ever seen," he managed to say. Inside, the celebration continued. The cake was cut, stories were shared, and laughter filled every corner of the cafe. James watched as his daughters danced together, their differences complementing rather than dividing them now. Naira's confidence balanced Leah's grace, their movements in perfect harmony. Autumn painted the town in shades of amber and gold, scattering crisp leaves across the sidewalks like nature's confetti. James walked with Naira and Leah to school, their small hands tucked safely in his. The morning air carried a gentle chill, but their matching scarves, knitted by Sarah during her weekend visits, kept them warm. Mrs. Peterson waved from her front porch, her smile genuine now, not forced like it had been months ago. The baker from down the street called out a cheerful good morning, and even old Mr. Thompson, who had once crossed the street to avoid them, tipped his hat in greeting. "Look, Dad," Leah pointed to a cluster of golden leaves swirling in the wind. "They're dancing." "Just like you in ballet class," Naira added, squeezing her sister's hand. The town wasn't perfect. James still noticed occasional sideways glances, still heard whispered comments. But change had taken root, growing slowly but surely, like the stubborn wildflowers that pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. At school, the hallways buzzed with excitement. The annual storytelling contest results were about to be announced. Naira had entered, despite her initial hesitation. James remembered how she'd practiced in front of the bathroom mirror for weeks, her voice growing stronger with each rehearsal. The principal's voice crackled over the intercom. "And the winner of this year's storytelling contest is Naira Calloway for her piece, What Love Looks Like." The classroom erupted in applause. Naira's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, wiped away a tear. "Would you like to share your story with the class again?" Naira stood tall, her dark eyes bright with pride. Leah pulled out the illustrations she'd created, pages filled with watercolor scenes that captured their journey. The first page showed two small figures in the snow. Another depicted a man opening his door to them, and others portrayed moments of their life together, making pancakes, reading stories, planting gardens. "Once upon a time," Naira began, her voice clear and strong, "there were two sisters who didn't know where they belonged. One sister had skin like midnight, the other like moonlight, but their hearts beat the same rhythm." The story unfolded like a flower opening to the sun. Naira spoke of fear and loneliness, of finding hope in unexpected places, of a stranger who became family. She didn't shy away from the hard parts, the prejudice, the confusion, the pain of feeling different, but she wove them into a larger tapestry of love and belonging. Leah held up each illustration as Naira spoke, their collaboration as natural as breathing. The final page showed three figures, tall, medium, and small, standing together under a sky full of stars. When Naira finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the boys who usually made fun of mushy stuff were sniffling. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged both girls, whispering, "You've taught us all something important today." At home, the backyard had transformed into a riot of color and life. Sarah visited every Wednesday now, bringing gardening tools and knowledge passed down from her grandmother. Under her guidance, the girls had planted sunflowers that reached toward the sky, tomato plants that sprawled across wire cages, and patches of lavender that perfumed the air. "The sunflowers are almost as tall as Dad," Naira exclaimed, measuring herself against the sturdy stalks. Sarah laughed, showing Leah how to check if the tomatoes were ripe. "Your father's got a green thumb too, you know. Look how well he's helped everything grow." James watched from the back steps, sipping lemonade and marveling at how naturally Sarah fit into their lives now. The anger and fear that had once divided them had mellowed into understanding, then friendship. They were connected by something stronger than the past, the future they both wanted for their daughters. That evening, while James prepared dinner, Leah appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a familiar piece of paper. The edges were worn soft, the creases deep from repeated folding. It was the note from the basket, the one that had started everything. "Protect them. Don't let him find them." "You kept it?" Leah asked, her golden eyes curious. James set down the spatula and knelt to her level. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He touched the paper gently, remembering that cold night and the weight of trust it represented. "It reminded me that someone believed I could protect you. I wasn't going to let them down." Leah wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "You didn't," she whispered. "You never did." After dinner, James read their nightly story. They were working through Bridge to Terabithia now. The girls snuggled close on either side of him, asking questions and making predictions about what would happen next. Their voices blended together, Naira's deeper tones harmonizing with Leah's lighter ones. When the chapter ended, he kissed them both goodnight, tucking the blankets around them just the way they liked. "Sweet dreams, my sunflowers," he said, using their special nickname. Outside, the evening air was crisp and clear. James stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the cafe sign that still made his heart swell with pride. Calloway and Daughters Cafe glowed softly in the gathering dusk, each letter a testament to the family they'd built together. Behind him, he heard muffled giggles floating down from the girl's bedroom window, probably sharing secrets or making up stories as they often did before sleep truly claimed them. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket, familiar and precious. James smiled and whispered to the night, "You're safe. You're home. You're loved." The wind rustled through the trees as the lights flickered off, and for the first time in a long, long time, everything felt whole. If you enjoyed the story of James and his daughters, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of James and his daughters, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.